The evening was bright and full of chatter as the grand hall filled with people. Families were dressed in their best clothes, excited to see their children perform at the city's annual piano recital. The hall smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh flowers placed along the stage. The large piano stood under the golden lights, shining like a jewel, waiting for another pair of confident hands to play it. At the very back of the hall, a modest woman sat quietly, holding her small purse on her lap. Her clothes were plain and simple compared to the elegant dresses and suits around her. She didn't try to draw attention, and no one paid much attention to her. People were busy greeting one another, talking about their children and complimenting each other's outfits. The woman simply smiled when someone brushed past her, though no one really stopped to speak to her. She had arrived early just to watch others play. The sound of music had always given her comfort. But there was something else, something deeper. She had played the piano for years in private, away from crowds and eyes. Life had not been kind or easy, but she found her peace in the melodies that only she understood. Tonight she was here not to perform, but simply to listen. The stage lights dimmed slightly and the host stepped forward, welcoming everyone. The audience clapped warmly as he introduced the first young pianist. A teenage boy walked proudly to the stage, bowing with confidence. His parents smiled from the front row. As his fingers touched the keys, the room filled with a lively tune. The audience nodded and whispered compliments about his technique and grace. One by one, the performers came forward, each one neatly dressed, each one introduced with pride and applause. The audience enjoyed every moment, but there was a certain rhythm to their reactions. They clapped politely, smiled, and then waited for the next act. It was all expected, all routine. The modest woman kept her hands folded and listened with quiet focus, her eyes fixed on the piano. She could tell when someone played from memory and when someone played from emotion. She noticed small details. How a performer's hand trembled slightly before a difficult part. How the sound changed when they felt nervous or proud. When the fourth performer finished, a short break was announced. People stood up, stretched, and talked again. The modest woman stayed seated, her eyes still on the piano. She had always believed that music wasn't about showing off. It was about feeling something real. But in this hall, surrounded by bright lights and fancy clothes, she wondered if people still believed that. After the break, the host walked on stage again, adjusting his microphone. He looked at a clipboard and frowned slightly. One of the participants hadn't arrived. There was an empty slot in the program. He whispered something to one of the assistants, who rushed to the back of the hall, looking a little anxious. The audience waited patiently, some checking their watches. The music had stopped and the silence felt heavy. Near the modest woman sat a kind older lady who had noticed her earlier. They had exchanged a small smile before the recital began. The older lady leaned closer now and whispered, "You play, don't you? I can tell by the way you watch the piano." The modest woman was surprised and shook her head lightly. "I used to," she said softly. "But not here, not in places like this." The older lady smiled knowingly. "You should. The piano doesn't care what you wear or where you sit. It just wants to be played." Before she could respond, the assistant from the stage came to their row, still looking worried. The older lady quickly said, "She plays. She can fill the empty slot," pointing at the modest woman. The assistant blinked in surprise, looking at her plain clothes and gentle posture. "Are you sure?" he asked, clearly unsure himself. The woman looked down at her hands. Her heart began to race. It had been years since she played in front of anyone. Her father used to tell her that music was meant to be shared, not hidden. But that was a long time ago. Still, something inside her stirred. Maybe this was a chance. Maybe tonight she could play, not for fame, but for the love of music itself. "I can try," she said quietly. The assistant nodded quickly and hurried off to tell the host. Moments later, the host's voice echoed through the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, it seems one of our performers could not make it tonight, but we have a volunteer who has kindly agreed to fill in." He smiled, though his tone carried a trace of doubt. "Please welcome our next performer." People looked around curiously as the modest woman slowly rose from her seat. The whispers began immediately. Some people frowned, confused. Others looked mildly amused. "Who is she?" One person murmured. "Is she someone's mother?" Another whispered. A few people chuckled softly, assuming it was a joke. She didn't hear them clearly, but she could feel their judgment. Her hands felt cold, but she held her head high and walked toward the stage. The lights grew brighter as she stepped closer, and her heart pounded like a drum. She could hear every footstep she took. The host gave her a polite smile, stepping aside as she approached the piano. From the front row, the Maestro, a respected teacher and critic known for his sharp words, watched her carefully. He leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, clearly skeptical. To him, every performance was about skill, not emotion. And this woman, with her quiet demeanor and simple dress, didn't look like she belonged on that stage. She reached the piano and stood silently for a moment. The grand instrument gleamed under the lights, its polished surface reflecting her face. She touched the edge gently, almost like greeting an old friend. The crowd grew silent, waiting to see what she would do. She pulled out the piano stool, adjusted it slightly, and sat down. The audience waited. Her fingers hovered above the keys but didn't move. In that stillness, she closed her eyes. Memories flooded her mind. The sound of her father's laughter, the warmth of their small living room, the old upright piano they used to play together. He had taught her not to fear mistakes but to love every note, even the imperfect ones. That memory steadied her trembling hands, a deep breath. Then one soft touch of a single key. The sound was clear, gentle, but full of depth. The note seemed to float in the air, hanging for a long moment before fading. The murmurs stopped. Something about that note was different, calm, honest, and full of emotion. The Maestro raised an eyebrow, now slightly intrigued. She pressed another key and then another. Slowly, the melody began to form. Her hands, though nervous at first, soon found their rhythm. The room filled with a sound that didn't need words to explain itself. Every note carried a feeling, soft sadness, quiet hope, and unspoken love. It was not loud or showy, but it reached everyone. Even those who had laughed earlier found themselves leaning forward, listening closely. The woman lost herself in the music. The lights, the people, the whispers, they all faded. Only the piano and her heart remained. She played as if she was speaking through the keys, telling her life story without saying a single word. The Maestro, who had been silent the whole time, leaned forward now, eyes fixed on her hands. He recognized something rare, an honesty that no technical training could create. This was the kind of music that came from real life, from joy and pain mixed together. It reminded him why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. When the last note came, it lingered softly before fading into silence. The hall remained still. For a moment, no one moved or spoke. The audience seemed to hold their breath, unsure if it was truly over. The modest woman slowly lifted her hands from the keys and stood up. Her heart was still racing, but she felt light, free even. Then slowly the silence broke. A few people began to clap. The sound grew louder and louder until it filled the hall. The audience rose to their feet, applauding and cheering. Some even had tears in their eyes. The modest woman looked surprised, almost embarrassed. She gave a small bow, her eyes shining softly under the lights. She turned to leave the stage, still hearing the applause echoing behind her. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not for how she looked, but for what she carried inside. Music had spoken for her in a way words never could. At the front row, the Maestro stood slowly and joined the applause. His face was no longer cold. He looked thoughtful, almost humbled. As she walked off the stage, their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a small nod of respect. The woman smiled faintly and walked back to her seat. Around her, people whispered again, but this time it was not with doubt. It was with admiration. The same crowd that had ignored her before now couldn't stop talking about her. Yet she sat quietly again, holding her purse in her lap, her heart full of peace. That night she had not planned to perform. She didn't come for applause or recognition. But by simply sharing what was inside her, she reminded everyone in that hall of something pure. That true music isn't about perfection or appearance. It's about feeling. And for one unforgettable evening, her modest melody made the entire world listen. After the applause slowly faded, the hall returned to its calm rhythm. People began to talk again, though now their voices carried wonder instead of arrogance. The modest woman sat back down in her chair, her hands still trembling slightly. She couldn't believe what had just happened. For years she had hidden her love for music, keeping it only for herself. And yet tonight, in front of strangers, she had played like she had never played before. Something inside her had opened, and it felt both terrifying and freeing. A few people nearby turned to her with kind smiles. Some even whispered compliments, still amazed by what they had heard. The older lady beside her gently patted her hand. "I told you," she said softly. "The piano just wanted to be played." The woman smiled shyly, feeling warmth rise to her cheeks. The host came back to the stage, still visibly impressed. "Well," he said, chuckling lightly, "that was an unexpected and beautiful moment. Let's give her one more round of applause." The audience cheered again, and though she wanted to hide from the attention, the modest woman stood up slightly and bowed once more, trying not to draw too much focus. When the event ended, people began to leave in small groups. Some stopped to talk to her on their way out, asking her where she had learned to play or if she was a teacher. She gave small, humble answers, saying she just played for herself and never studied anywhere special. They looked at her with even more admiration because of that. The truth was, she had learned everything from her father. He had been a quiet man who worked many small jobs, but every night, no matter how tired he was, he would sit beside her at their old piano and teach her simple songs. He always said, "Music is not about showing others how good you are. It's about showing your heart." As the hall emptied, the maestro remained seated near the front. He had not left like the others. He seemed lost in thought. When the woman finally gathered the courage to stand up and walk out, he approached her slowly. His steps were calm, deliberate. The few people still cleaning up glanced at him curiously. He was known for his pride, and it was rare to see him approach anyone first. He stopped a few feet away and said in a low voice, "You play differently." The woman hesitated. "I'm sorry if I broke any rules. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, gently cutting her off. "No, you didn't break anything. You reminded me what real music sounds like." His voice was thoughtful, almost tired. "These days people play with perfect skill but no feeling. What you did tonight, it was real." She looked down, unsure what to say. Compliments always made her uncomfortable. "I just played what I felt," she whispered. The maestro nodded slowly. "That's exactly why it worked." He studied her for a moment, then said, "Would you come by the conservatory sometime? I teach there. I'd like to hear you play again." Her eyes widened in surprise. "Me, at the conservatory? I don't think I belong there." He gave a faint smile. "Talent doesn't ask for permission. If you have it, you use it." Before she could answer, another assistant called him over. He gave her a small nod and walked away, leaving her standing there with her heart full of mixed emotions. She had never thought anyone would notice her playing, much less a maestro. She felt both grateful and frightened. What if she wasn't good enough for a place like that? What if tonight had just been luck? She walked out into the cool night air. The city lights shimmered on the wet pavement. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and began walking toward the bus stop. As she walked, she kept thinking about the maestro's words. A small part of her wanted to ignore them and return to her quiet life. But another part, the one that still remembered her father's old lessons, wanted to see where this could lead. The next few days passed slowly. She returned to her simple daily routine, working at the small shop, tidying her tiny apartment, cooking simple meals. But even while she worked, her mind kept returning to the piano. The melody she played that night still echoed in her heart. Sometimes, while doing chores, she would hum parts of it, smiling without realizing. One evening, as she closed the shop, she passed by a small music store. In the display window stood a second-hand keyboard. It wasn't much, slightly worn, a few scratches on the sides, but it reminded her of the piano from her childhood. She stepped inside and asked the owner if she could try it. He nodded kindly. She sat down and pressed one key. Even the weak sound brought tears to her eyes. She played softly just for a few minutes. The store owner listened quietly, then said, "You play with feeling. People don't play like that anymore." She smiled faintly and said, "It's just something I do when no one's listening." He laughed. "You might be surprised who's listening." He offered her a small discount, seeing the look in her eyes. After a moment of thought, she bought it, using the little savings she had. Carrying it home was not easy, but she didn't mind. It felt like she was bringing home a piece of her old self. That night, she placed the keyboard by her window where the moonlight fell across the keys. She sat down and began to play again. She didn't need an audience this time. It was just her and the music. But as she played, she remembered the feeling of that hall, the stillness after her first note, the way people had listened without breathing. For the first time, she began to wonder, Maybe she could do more than just play for herself. A few days later, a letter arrived. It was from the conservatory. The maestro had written it personally. It said he had arranged a small session for her to visit. No pressure, just a friendly meeting to play again. Her heart pounded as she read it. She wasn't sure whether to go or not. What if she embarrassed herself? But she could almost hear her father's voice in her head. Gentle and encouraging. When someone opens a door for you, don't be afraid to walk through. The morning of the meeting, she dressed simply but neatly. The conservatory building was large and beautiful, with high ceilings and walls lined with portraits of famous composers. She felt small walking through those halls, but when she entered the small practice room where the maestro waited, she saw a familiar sight. A grand piano gleaming under soft light. The maestro greeted her warmly. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. She smiled nervously. "I almost didn't." He nodded as if he understood. "Then I'm glad you did. Play anything you like." She sat at the piano, her hands shaking slightly. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a small clock on the wall. She closed her eyes just as she had that night at the recital and began to play. This time the tune was slower, softer, a song she used to play for her father when he was sick. The melody carried her feelings in every note: love, loss, and peace. When she finished, the maestro didn't speak right away. He stood silently, then said, "You don't need lessons in technique. What you need is a stage." Her breath caught. "A stage?" "Yes," he said simply. "People need to hear you. There's truth in your playing, and the world has forgotten how that sounds." She didn't know how to respond. The thought of performing again scared her, but she also felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The maestro continued, "There's a small concert next month. Nothing grand, but I'd like you to play one piece. I'll take care of everything else." Her instinct was to say no, to hide again behind her quiet life. But instead, she found herself nodding slowly. "I'll try," she said. The maestro smiled faintly. "That's all I ask." When she left the conservatory that day, the air outside felt different. The world seemed bigger, brighter. She walked home slowly, thinking about what had just happened. For years, she had believed her music didn't matter to anyone but herself. Now someone who truly understood music was telling her it did. That night, she sat by her keyboard again, her fingers resting gently on the keys. She didn't play right away. She just sat there thinking of all the moments that had brought her to this point. The laughter of her father, the silence of that audience, the kind words of a stranger who saw her worth. Then she smiled softly and began to play again, her melody flowing out into the quiet night, carrying her dreams forward one note at a time. Days turned into weeks, and the modest woman began to feel both excited and nervous about the upcoming concert. She practiced every evening after work, her small apartment filling with the soft sound of piano keys. Her old keyboard didn't sound as beautiful as the grand pianos at the hall, but for her it was enough. She didn't need perfection. She just needed to play with honesty. Each note reminded her of where she came from, and each song became a quiet conversation between her and her past. She practiced not because she wanted fame, but because she didn't want to disappoint the maestro who had believed in her. Every time she closed her eyes and let her fingers move, she imagined her father sitting beside her again, nodding gently to the rhythm. Sometimes she would stop mid-song, her eyes filling with tears, but then she'd take a deep breath and continue. Music was her way of healing, and now it was leading her somewhere she never expected. One afternoon, while she was playing softly, there was a knock on her door. She quickly turned down the volume and opened it. To her surprise, it was the maestro himself, holding a folder in one hand. "I was nearby," he said with a rare smile. "I thought I'd check in." "May I?" She stepped aside shyly. "Of course, please come in." He looked around the small, neat apartment and noticed the keyboard by the window. "So this is where you practice," he said thoughtfully. "Not exactly a concert hall, but it has heart," she smiled. "It's all I have, but it feels like home." He nodded and handed her the folder. Inside were a few pieces of sheet music. "These are some of my favorite classical works," he said. "You don't need to copy them exactly. I'd like to hear what they sound like when you play them your way." She looked up, surprised. "My way?" "Yes," he said firmly. "That's what makes you special. You don't play like anyone else. You play like yourself." She felt shy but grateful. "I'll do my best." "I know you will," he said with a small nod. Before leaving, he paused at the door. "Remember, this concert isn't about showing off. It's about sharing what's inside you. The audience will feel it if you're honest." When he left, she sat down again, opening the sheets carefully. The notes looked complex, but she didn't feel intimidated. Instead, she began to hum softly, finding her own rhythm. The music came to her naturally, like a familiar voice. The days that followed were full of quiet discipline. She worked at the shop by day, and as soon as she came home, she sat at her keyboard until midnight. The neighbors downstairs sometimes paused to listen, their apartments filled with her soft melodies. Some evenings, they would leave their windows open just to hear her better. One evening, as she practiced, the older lady from the recital came to visit. She had become a good friend since that night. Carrying a small basket of food, she smiled warmly. "You need to eat more than you play," she teased. The woman laughed softly and invited her in. They ate together, and the older lady listened as she played a short piece. "You sound ready," the lady said after a moment. "That music feels alive. It's like you're telling a story without words." "That's how I've always felt about it," the modest woman replied. "It's the only way I know how to speak freely." When the day of the concert finally arrived, the city was glowing with evening lights. The event was smaller than the first recital, but filled with people who truly loved music. The maestro had made sure it was held in an intimate setting, a hall that felt warm and welcoming, not grand or intimidating. The audience included music teachers, students, and a few journalists. Yet among them, she could still spot her friend sitting in the front row, smiling encouragingly. Backstage, she could hear the faint hum of the audience chatting. She held her hands together to stop them from shaking. The maestro approached her quietly. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, though her voice trembled slightly. "A little nervous." He gave her a calm look. "Good, that means you care. Just breathe and let the piano do the talking." Her turn came after two other performers. When the host called her name, she stepped onto the stage, her simple dress catching the soft glow of the lights. The murmurs in the crowd quieted. Some recognized her from the last recital. Others looked curious, wondering what the maestro saw in this modest woman. She sat down at the grand piano, her reflection visible on its glossy surface. Taking a deep breath, she placed her fingers gently on the keys. The first sound was soft like a whisper. Then came the second, blending into a melody that flowed like water. The hall fell into complete silence. She wasn't thinking about the audience anymore. She was back in her small living room as a child, sitting beside her father. She could almost hear his voice again, encouraging her to keep going. Her music carried that memory, full of love and longing. Every note spoke of her journey, the years of silence, the fears, and the courage it took to stand there now. Halfway through the piece, she closed her eyes, letting her fingers move freely. The melody grew stronger, richer. It wasn't about technical perfection. It was about truth. The audience could feel it. Even the journalist stopped writing for a moment, caught in the raw emotion of her performance. The maestro, sitting near the stage, had a proud yet humble expression. He knew what he was witnessing wasn't just a performance, it was a soul speaking. When the last note faded, the silence that followed was almost sacred. No one clapped right away. They just sat there, stunned as if they didn't want to break the moment. Then slowly the applause began, soft at first, then louder until the entire hall was standing. The modest woman stood and bowed gently. Her eyes glistened, but she smiled with quiet grace. The maestro stood as well, clapping with genuine respect. When she looked at him, he nodded slightly, a silent message that said, "You did it." After the concert, people came to her, asking about her background, her story, her inspiration. Some wanted to take photos, others just wanted to thank her. She felt overwhelmed by their kindness, but stayed humble. "I'm just grateful you listened," she kept saying. Later, when most people had left, the maestro approached her again. "You played beautifully," he said. "The kind of beauty that can't be taught." She smiled softly. "Thank you for believing in me." He shook his head. "You did this yourself. I only gave you a chance." Then, after a pause, he added, "There's another concert next season, a bigger one. I want you to be part of it. No pressure, but think about it." Her heart raced at the thought. She looked down at her hands, the same hands that had once trembled with doubt. Now they felt strong, steady. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. On her way home, she walked through the cool night air. holding the small program from the concert in her hand. The city lights shimmered like stars on the wet pavement. For the first time in years, she felt like her life had a new melody, one full of hope and possibility. When she reached home, she placed the concert program on her table and sat by her keyboard again. She touched the keys, still feeling the echo of the grand piano under her fingers. She began to play softly, not for practice this time, but just to express how she felt. The tune was gentle and full of peace. Outside, the moonlight shone through her window, resting on her face as she played. As the night went on, she thought about how far she had come. From being ignored in a crowded hall to being applauded for her truth, it felt like a dream. Yet deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Her journey with music wasn't about fame or applause. It was about sharing something real. And as her melody filled the quiet room, she realized that even if the world stopped listening tomorrow, she would still play. Because for her, music was not about being heard, it was about being alive. Weeks after the concert, the modest woman's life slowly returned to its quiet rhythm. But something had changed. Everywhere she went, people seemed to recognize her. At the shop where she worked, customers would whisper, "Isn't that the woman who played at the concert?" Some even came just to see her, smiling warmly as they passed by. She was humble about it, always saying, it was just one performance. But deep inside, she felt a spark that wouldn't fade. That night on stage had awakened something she thought she had lost forever. Each evening after closing the shop, she sat by her keyboard and played. The melodies came to her naturally now, without effort. Sometimes she played joyful tunes full of light, and other times soft, emotional ones that carried a quiet sadness. The neighbors, who had grown used to her music, often left their windows open, letting her songs drift through the building. Children in the courtyard would stop their games just to listen for a while. She didn't know it, but her music had become part of the neighborhood's life. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the Maestro. The handwriting was neat and formal, but his words were warm. He thanked her again for her performance and invited her to meet him at the conservatory. He wanted to discuss something important. Her heart raced as she read it. She wasn't sure what to expect, but curiosity and gratitude filled her heart. The next morning, she took the early bus to the conservatory. The building looked even more impressive than before. As she entered, the sound of pianos echoed through the halls, students practicing, teachers giving lessons. She paused for a moment, taking in the sound that had always felt like home to her. When she reached the maestro's office, he was sitting by the window, reading a sheet of music. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "I'm glad you came," he said kindly. "Please, have a seat." She sat down quietly, her hands resting in her lap. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about how people reacted to your performance. They didn't just hear your music, they felt it. That's rare. Most people play beautifully, but they don't touch hearts. You did. That's why I want to ask you something." She listened carefully, unsure where he was going. "There's an upcoming charity concert," he continued. "It's meant to raise money for children who can't afford music education. I want you to play there. It's not about fame or competition, it's about giving something back." Her eyes widened. "Me? But there must be so many other talented players." He nodded. "Yes, but none who can reach people the way you do. You play with truth, and that's what this concert needs." She thought for a moment, her heart pounding. Playing for a cause like that felt meaningful, but also frightening. Still, she remembered what her father used to tell her. If your gift can help someone, don't hide it. With a small, nervous smile, she said, "I'll do it." The maestro looked pleased. "Good, it will be in 3 weeks. I'll help you prepare if you like." Over the next few days, she practiced harder than ever. The maestro would sometimes sit with her, giving gentle advice but never changing her natural style. He understood that her strength came from her emotion, not from strict technique. Together, they chose a few pieces that carried warmth and hope, songs that could move people's hearts. The news of the charity concert spread quickly. Posters appeared around the city, with her name written in simple letters. Some of her neighbors saw them and came to tell her. They were proud, calling her our pianist. Though she blushed every time, she couldn't help but smile. It felt good to bring pride to people who had quietly supported her. As the day of the concert approached, her nerves returned. She lay awake some nights staring at the ceiling, wondering if she could do it again. What if this time she failed? What if people were disappointed? But then she would remember the faces of the children the concert was for, and she'd whisper to herself, "This isn't about me. It's about them." The evening of the concert came. The hall was packed, but this time it felt different. There was warmth in the air, not the heavy pressure of judgment. Families sat together, children whispering excitedly, and the audience was full of everyday people, not critics, not experts, just listeners. The woman stood backstage taking deep breaths, her hands slightly cold. The maestro came up beside her. "Just play like you always do," he said softly. "Let them hear your heart." When her name was called, she stepped out onto the stage. The lights were bright, but she wasn't afraid this time. She sat at the piano and took a moment to look at the crowd. There were children sitting in the front rows, their eyes wide with curiosity. She smiled at them gently, then placed her hands on the keys. The first song she played was calm and tender, filled with a quiet happiness. The sound floated through the hall like a gentle breeze. The children in the front row leaned forward, completely still. She played as if she were telling them a bedtime story through music. The audience listened silently, drawn in by every note. Then she moved on to a softer melody, one that carried deep emotion. It was inspired by her own childhood, the struggles, the long nights when her father worked late, and the way he still found time to teach her music. Each note carried love, loss, and gratitude. The maestro watched her from the side of the stage, deeply moved. He could see the audience wiping tears from their eyes. Finally, she ended with a lively, hopeful tune. It was a song that spoke of courage and new beginnings. When she played the final note, the hall erupted with applause. The sound was so loud it echoed off the walls. The children in the front row stood up and clapped, their smiles shining brightly. The woman stood and bowed, tears glistening in her eyes. It wasn't pride she felt, it was joy, pure and simple. After the concert, the maestro joined her on stage. He raised her hand gently, smiling with pride. "This," he said to the crowd, "is what true music sounds like." The applause grew even louder. She looked down, shy but happy. For her, the greatest reward was knowing that her music had helped someone. That night, as she left the hall, people stopped her to thank her. Some said her music reminded them of their parents. Others said it gave them hope. A small boy ran up to her with a paper program and asked for her autograph. She laughed softly and signed it, her heart full. When she finally stepped outside, the cool night air felt peaceful. The sky above was full of stars, and for the first time she allowed herself to dream a little bigger. The next morning, she went back to work at the shop as usual. Her co-workers congratulated her, showing her a newspaper article with her photo from the concert. The headline read, "The modest pianist who touched every heart." She blushed and laughed quietly, saying, "They're exaggerating." But the kindness in their smiles told her that her music truly meant something. In the weeks that followed, she continued playing, not for fame but because it had become part of who she was. The maestro visited her occasionally, bringing new sheet music or inviting her to small community events. Sometimes she even taught the neighborhood children a few simple tunes on her keyboard. She loved watching their faces light up when they played their first song. It reminded her of her own beginnings, sitting beside her father and learning one key at a time. Her life was still simple, but it was full of meaning. Every day she found beauty in the smallest things, the sound of rain tapping the window, the laughter of children, the smell of freshly baked bread from the bakery nearby. She had discovered that music wasn't just something to perform, it was a way to live, to connect, to give. One evening, as she sat by her window playing softly, she thought about how unexpected her journey had been. A few months ago, she had been just another face in the crowd, ignored and unseen. Now her music had reached hundreds of people, not because of fame, but because she played with honesty. That thought made her smile. She looked out at the street below, where a few people paused to listen to her music drifting from the window. And as her fingers danced across the keys, she knew that even if she never played on a big stage again, she had already found what she was searching for, a reason to keep playing. Months passed and the woman's life settled into a new rhythm. Her days were still simple, filled with work and small routines, but her evenings had changed forever. Every night after closing her small shop, she returned home, sat by her old keyboard and played. The music that once stayed within her small apartment now carried further, through open windows, down quiet streets, and into people's hearts. Neighbors would sometimes pause outside just to listen. It was as if the sound had become a kind of comfort in their daily lives. She never sought attention, yet it seemed to find her. One morning as she opened her shop, she saw a small envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a handwritten note. "Your music gives me peace after hard days. Please don't ever stop playing." There was no name, no address, just those words. She smiled softly, touched by the kindness of a stranger. It reminded her why she played, not for applause, but because music had a way of healing what words could not. Meanwhile, the maestro had not forgotten her. He often spoke of her to his students, telling them how true art comes from sincerity, not perfection. One day, he visited her shop again, holding a small bouquet of white lilies. "You've inspired many people," he said gently. "There's another event coming, a concert for the city's music festival. I want you to play there, not because you owe anyone, but because your music belongs to more hearts than you think." She hesitated at first. The thought of another big stage made her nervous. She wasn't sure she wanted the spotlight again. But the maestro's eyes carried such quiet faith that she finally nodded. "I'll do it," she said softly. He smiled, knowing it took courage for her to say yes. In the weeks leading up to the festival, she practiced every night. Her small apartment filled with melodies, each piece chosen with care. She didn't want to impress anyone. She just wanted to share something honest. Sometimes, when her fingers trembled from long hours, she would close her eyes and remember her father's voice saying, "Music is a conversation with the soul. You just have to listen." Those words guided her every time doubt crept in. The night of the festival arrived. The concert hall was grander than any she had played in before. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the stage gleamed under warm lights. She stood backstage, her hands slightly cold, watching other performers finish their turns. Their pieces were flawless, technically perfect, but distant. When her name was called, she took a deep breath and stepped forward. The moment she sat at the piano, silence filled the hall. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, but instead of fear, she felt calm. She began to play a piece she had written herself, a melody born from quiet nights, long memories, and the gentle rhythm of everyday life. The sound was soft at first, like a whisper. Then it grew stronger, fuller, filled with emotion. Each note seemed to tell a story of resilience, of finding light after long shadows. As she played, something beautiful happened. The audience leaned in, completely still. Even the maestro, sitting in the front row, closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. It wasn't grand or dramatic, it was human, real, and deeply moving. When the final note faded, there was a heartbeat of silence before the applause began. It grew and grew until the hall was alive with clapping, cheers, and even tears. Some people stood applauding with both hands, moved by something they couldn't explain. The woman rose slowly, bowing with humility. She didn't smile widely or wave. She simply nodded with gratitude. The maestro came to the stage, taking her hand once again. "You've reminded us all why we love music," he said softly. The audience cheered louder. She looked down, shyly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she realized her gift was meant to be shared. After the concert, people gathered around her. Journalists wanted interviews. Students asked for advice, and strangers thanked her for touching their hearts. One woman said, "I lost my husband last year. Your song made me feel like he was still with me." Tears filled the modest woman's eyes. She didn't know what to say, so she simply placed her hand over her heart and whispered, "Thank you." That night, when she returned home, the city was quiet. She changed out of her dress, brewed a cup of tea, and sat by the window. The moonlight spilled across her keyboard, glowing softly. She placed her hands on the keys and played again, this time just for herself. The melody was gentle, filled with peace. For the first time in years, she felt truly free. Free from fear, from doubt, from hiding. The following week, her story appeared in local newspapers. Headlines called her, "The woman who plays from the heart." But she didn't let fame change her. She still walked to work, still greeted neighbors with a smile, and still played music in her small apartment at night. The only difference was that now, her music reached further. Videos of her performance spread online, touching thousands who had never even met her. Messages began to arrive from across the country. Some were from young musicians who said her story gave them courage to follow their dreams. Others were from people who said her music helped them through lonely times. She read every letter with care, often smiling or crying quietly as she did. It amazed her how something as simple as a melody could connect so many hearts. The maestro invited her to teach at the conservatory, but she politely declined. "I don't think I'm meant to teach in classrooms," she said, "but I'll keep playing for whoever needs to listen." He respected her choice, knowing that her strength came from being true to herself. One evening, as she walked home, she passed by a small park. A group of children were sitting around an old public piano trying to play simple tunes. They noticed her and asked, "Can you show us how to play something?" She smiled and sat with them, guiding their little hands on the keys. Soon, laughter and soft music filled the air. The children clapped for her and she clapped for them. It was a simple moment, but it felt perfect. Over time, her small acts of kindness became her legacy. She performed at hospitals, community centers, and schools, never asking for money. For her, the joy came from watching faces light up. People began calling her the heart pianist. She found that title funny but touching. It wasn't about fame, it was about sharing warmth in a world that often forgot to slow down and listen. As the seasons changed, she continued to play. Even on rainy days, her window glowed with soft light as her music filled the streets. Sometimes she'd pause between notes and listen to the rain, smiling at how it blended with her song. Life was still modest, still simple, but it was full of meaning. One night, the maestro visited her again. They sat together, drinking tea and talking about how far she had come. "Do you realize," he said with a gentle laugh, "that you've done what many of us spend our whole lives chasing? You found peace in your art." She looked down, thoughtful, and replied, "Maybe peace finds you when you stop trying too hard to impress anyone." He nodded, smiling proudly. When he left, she sat at her piano again. Her fingers moved slowly, not to perform, not to prove anything, but simply to feel alive. The melody that came was soft, like a lullaby for the world outside her window. People walking by stopped and listened, just as they always had. The city lights shimmered, the night breeze carried her tune, and in that quiet moment, everything felt whole. Her journey had started with silence and doubt, but it led her to a life filled with connection, gratitude, and love. She had learned that music wasn't about being seen, it was about being felt. And as her final note lingered in the cool night air, she smiled to herself, knowing she had already said everything she needed to through her music. Years passed gently like soft pages turning in a quiet book. The modest woman who once sat unnoticed in the back of a concert hall was now loved by many. Her name had become a symbol of sincerity and kindness, though she never thought of herself that way. To her, she was still the same person who loved music, not fame. She continued to live in her small apartment, work at the same shop, and play the same old piano by the window every evening. But something about her presence had changed. Wherever she went, people smiled a little brighter, as if her calmness brought light to their day. The city had changed too. It had grown busier, noisier, and faster, but her music remained like a gentle pause in the rush. People passing by her building at night could still hear her playing. Some even made it a routine. After work, they would take the long way home just to listen for a few minutes. For them, her music was a reminder that beauty still existed in ordinary life. The maestro, now older and walking with a cane, still visited her often. They would sit together, share tea, and talk about how unpredictable life could be. "You've done more for the city than any of us expected," he once said with a kind smile. She shook her head, laughing softly. "I've only played what I feel," she replied. But he looked at her with gentle seriousness. "And that's exactly why it matters." One spring morning, she received a letter from the city's cultural committee. They wanted to honor her for her contribution to the arts. The letter invited her to perform one last time at the city's grand anniversary celebration. It would be the largest audience she had ever played for. At first, she thought of declining. Her hands had grown weaker over the years, and long performances tired her quickly. But then she thought about all the people her music had touched. Those who listened from the streets, the children she taught, and even strangers who had written her letters. She decided she wanted to give them one more melody. In the weeks leading up to the concert, she practiced quietly every evening. Her fingers moved slower now, but each note carried depth and feeling. She wasn't chasing perfection anymore. She was speaking with her heart. The maestro visited often, sitting nearby as she played. "You've still got it," he said with a grin. "I don't think music ever leaves you." She smiled and replied, "It's the only language that never fades." The day of the concert arrived. The hall was decorated beautifully, filled with people of all ages. Some had grown up listening to her music. Others had come after hearing stories about her. The atmosphere was warm, filled with admiration and love. Backstage, the woman sat quietly, her hands folded, feeling both nervous and peaceful. She could hear the murmurs of the crowd, the soft rustle of programs being opened. The maestro, standing beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder. "Play it your way," he whispered. "That's all anyone wants." When her name was announced, the entire hall erupted in applause before she even stepped out. As she walked to the piano, the audience rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. She bowed her head humbly, her eyes glistening. Taking her seat, she touched the keys gently, feeling their familiar smoothness beneath her fingertips. The first few notes rang softly through the hall. She played an original piece, a collection of all the melodies that had shaped her journey. Each part carried a memory: her father's teachings, the night she played for the maestro, the charity concert, the laughter of the neighborhood children, and the peace of quiet nights by her window. The audience sat in complete stillness, some holding their breath, others wiping away tears. Her music was more than sound. It was a story told without words. Halfway through the piece, she paused for a moment. She looked out at the audience and smiled, a warm, grateful smile that said everything she couldn't put into words. Then she continued, her hands moving gracefully, the sound deepening with emotion. It felt like she was saying goodbye, not with sadness, but with love. Every note was a thank you, every pause a memory. When the final note faded, the hall remained silent for a long, beautiful moment. Then the applause began, slow, then louder, until it became thunderous. People stood, clapping, cheering, some calling her name. The maestro had tears in his eyes. He walked to the stage, helped her to her feet, and hugged her gently. "You've given us something we'll never forget," he whispered. The woman smiled softly and said, "It was all of you who gave me the courage to play." That night became one of the most memorable evenings in the city's history. Newspapers wrote about it, calling it the melody of the heart. But for her, it was just another evening spent doing what she loved most. After the concert, life returned to its quiet rhythm. She still played at home, though less often, and sometimes she would sit by her window just watching the world go by. The children she once taught were now grown, some even becoming musicians themselves. They often visited her, bringing their own instruments, and together they played small tunes that filled the room with laughter. One of those evenings, as the sunset painted the sky in soft colors, the maestro came by again. He looked weaker than before, but his spirit was as bright as ever. "Do you know," he said, smiling, "your music will live on long after we're gone?" She chuckled. "Music doesn't belong to anyone. It just passes through us," he nodded. "And you've let it pass through beautifully." As time went on, her performances grew fewer, but her influence grew deeper. Schools named music rooms after her, and students played her compositions at local events. People spoke of her not as a star, but as someone who played from the soul. To them, she represented something pure and timeless, a reminder that true art doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. On a calm evening years later, she sat by her piano once more. The sky outside was golden, and the sound of distant laughter drifted through the open window. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play one last song. The melody was simple, slow, and full of warmth. It carried the story of her life, the struggles, the joy, the love she gave, and the peace she found. As she played, the world outside seemed to quiet, as if listening. When the final note lingered in the air, she closed her eyes and smiled. She didn't need applause this time. The silence was enough. It was peaceful, full, and whole. The next morning, the city woke to find her piano still open, a faint trace of her melody hanging in the air. Word spread quietly. She had passed peacefully in her sleep, her hands resting near the keys. There was no sadness, only a gentle gratitude that she had shared her gift for so long. In the weeks that followed, people gathered outside her building to light candles and play her music. Children she once taught placed flowers on her windowsill. The maestro, frail but strong in spirit, gave a short speech at her memorial. "She taught us," he said softly, "that music isn't about being heard. It's about making others feel less alone." Her piano was moved to the conservatory, where it was placed in a sunlit room for future students to use. Above it, a small plaque read, "She played with her heart and the world listened." Years later, her melodies were still played by people who had never met her, spreading comfort and inspiration. And somewhere in the hearts of those who once heard her play live, her music continued to echo, a quiet reminder that even the most modest soul can leave a lasting song in the world.